We all probably remember the hit show Family Guy, don't we? To refresh your memory, it's about the Griffin family of Quahog. The family consists of Peter, Lois, Chris, Meg, Stewie, and their pet dog Brian, going on wacky adventures. The show ran all the way till present day, going on to a 21st season, still airing. What many people don't know is that something that remains to be an open secret between the Fox executives and the show's creator, Seth MacFarlane. In Seth's case, it seems like everything seems bothering him after Family Guy was conceived. This thing or whatever's bothering him, it wasn't invented to get on the get-go, but the seasons went and it started becoming clear to the Fox executives. All this happened when Seth created one of the most famous and infamous characters. That character was Peter Griffin. The way I can describe Peter is this. Peter is the kind of character that's almost mixed feelings about his fans and critics alike. In the earliest seasons, Peter was dim-witted but still reasonable husband and father who gets into trouble most of the time. However, in the later episodes, Peter's behavior had begun to take a drastic change for the worst. Throughout the later seasons of Family Guy's run, Peter is now shown to doing multiple heinous crimes that could get him locked up if he were to imitate these crimes in real life. Notable examples include starting his own comic strip business and writing offensive strip, shooting Cleveland's son in the arm, etc. During this character flanderization of Peter, many of Family Guy fans and critics have started writing angry letters to the Fox executives, but more notably started sending them none other than Seth himself. The letters range from negative feedback surrounding Peter Griffin's character and personality, now than what he was in the previous seasons. While the others have threatened Seth to kill Peter off the show for good, Seth, intentionally skeptical, brushing off the whole thing as a joke, ignored the letters and continued with working on different episodes. However, the letters have begun to grow more and more negative, and many angry fans of Family Guy have begun publicly to mutilate and shame Seth in real life, shunning and angrily yelling at him for keeping Peter in the show. The letters kept on persisting and had begun to grow more worse with each passing moment. That led to a breaking point for Seth, as he was caught into a difficult and uneasy decision that had resolved immediately to relieve his stress. Then one day, Seth came to Fox and announced his intentions of making his very own episode of Family Guy. With the help of his friends and colleagues, what many of them didn't know was whoever that was Seth was planning on reworking the episodes was already in the development stages. The episode was in development at the time that was intentionally named Family Guy Behind the Scenes, where it revealed the Family Guy show within hosted by a Twilight Show esque narrator in a style similar to a documentary. It is also shown that not all the characters you know and loved and hated are the actors that said in this show. The episode under Seth's wishes, it was to title change to The Big Goal. Let's all go back to the so familiar year of 2016, shall we? It was a fine summer evening and Family Guy was on its 15th season at the time. However, something strange was happening during this quiet summer evening at 7 p.m. Many locals were watching television. The channel that they were watching was Adult Swim, and it was playing a rerun of Futurama. This is where things got a little strange and peculiar to ignore. The Futurama episode that was airing at the time just stopped. Yup, you heard me correctly. The episode of Futurama that was playing just stopped abruptly, just as the credits were about to roll. Many of the viewers were confused by the sudden abruption that they thought it was their TV systems malfunctioning. No matter what they did, whatever it was unplugging the set and plugging it back in, tampering with the remote, changing the sources, the TVs that are in the area just stayed frozen. After a few seconds, the TV sets immediately went completely black. Not just a temporarily black like you happen to see during thunderstorms when the satellite quality gets all fuzzy and distorted. This was a permanent darkness of black. Soon the text slowly began to fade on their TV screens. There is a transcription of the text that followed with this sudden intrusion of the broadcast television. Hello, America. This is Seth MacFarlane, the creator of Family Guy, American Dad, and The Cleveland Show. I have read your feedback on the most voted characters that I have voiced for the past 17 years. I have felt pressured into making this sudden announcement for fans who still watch the Griffin's shenanigans on television. What you are about to see is something that I want to get off my chest, and work on this as sort of a hatred for one of the characters begins skyrocketing. This is not a temporarily killing off situation like what happened with Brian back in season 12. This is a permanent thing. Why am I talking about this? This is because many fans request and demands Peter Griffin, one of the show's infamous characters, will be killed off in the special broadcast for all the content to see. To many of you still keeping their hatred of Peter Griffin during the last few seasons of Family Guy, I have one question to ask you. The next temporarily fade out for a while before came back with reading, "Are you happy now?" As the text immediately faded back out, a familiar black intermission is seen previously before it came back on. After a few seconds, the TV systems finally began resonating with the loud, sonorous beep sound that sounded akin to the dial tone usually heard in telephones. The sound came from every single housing area in the US, and the sound was also heard by a few passerbyers as well. After what seemed like minutes of this resonating beep, the white text began to fade into darkness, being the only visible on many TV screens. The text now said, this time in big font letters, "Family Guy, the big goal." Several white flashes then came onto the screen without any given warning, startling most of the viewers watching the sudden broadcast iteration. After the flashes stopped, it showed the Griffin house during the day with the normal cheery music playing. It showed the interior of the house where the whole family is sitting down on the living room. While watching TV, the usual movie TV show parody played on TV. After this TV segment was over, Lois announced that she had something special planned for Peter, telling him that he was going to go on a scavenger hunt for the day. Peter, being the man-child that he was, immediately go ho-ho about it, but Lois went upstairs and came back downstairs with a piece of paper that had writing inscribbled onto it. Peter, without hesitation, immediately grabbed the list and ran off the door as he giggled like a little child who had gotten his money to buy some ice cream. After Peter leaves the house, Lois walked into the doorway where she had a sinister expression on her face while steeped with her fingers together. She was stifling bits of laughter under her breath, and some viewers even stated they even heard murmur the words, "Yes, yes, it's all going according to plan." Back to the story. On the other hand, the screen went to black like most Family Guy episodes. Then it came back to the next scene. The next scene depicted Peter, shovel in hand, digging a hole near a highway. It seems to be a little activity said on the highway was the thing that the path that the Griffin family car. Peter is shown to be following the instructions on the map that Lois had gave him. Peter dug through most of the dirt in the search for the item that he supposedly listed on the small map. Eventually, he finds the item after digging extensively to find it. Peter uncovered his item and blew away some of the dirt that might have gone on top of it. The item was revealed to be a small wooden shoebox. Contained within the small shoebox was a white ceremonial robe. Peter was confused at such equipment being contained in a box, but was even more confused as to why the ceremonial robe was listed on the list. Peter intentionally called the whole thing off as a joke, but decided to play along with this made-up scavenger hunt. Without hesitation, he hopped into the car and proceeded to find the next item that was listed. The next item that led him to a dense forest-like setting. The forest had lots of trees, and some viewers had even claimed that the only thing they heard during this whole hooting of owls and hushed creaks of courtesy of multiple crickets. The backdrop was described to be having an eerie light time to feel to it, as the eerie forest was lit by the harsh light from the moon. Peter wandered throughout his vast land in search for the item next on his list. Peter was then guided back to the Moonlight's trail, similar to the real-life sea turtles who followed the moonlight headed back to the sea. Unlucky for him, The moonlight was blocked off by a few clouds that resulted in him in accidentally bumping into a nearby tree. The end result was just a strange object hitting Peter across the nose, causing it to bleed. Ow! What was that? Peter yelled, while holding up the tip of his nose to stop the bleeding. The camera then was panned to show the object in the grassy plains. Although the object was visible by the black shadow, the moonlight slowly began to reveal the mysterious object was. The moon finally struck the object with its light, and Peter was able to see exactly what had hit him. There, laying on the grass, was a long metal pole. The pole was described as having different sizes of rust on the surface of it. Peter inched closer and grabbed the pole. He followed the moon's trail to the exit of the forest. Upon arriving at his car, he opened the side door and placed the pole gently in the back seat, along with the shoebox he had found earlier in one day. Huh? That's it? That's all the items for the scavenger hunt? Peter asked with suspicion in his voice. Again, Peter decided to call the whole thing off as a joke and started the car engine in order to go home. While driving, Peter heard a loud growl coming out of nowhere. Peter, startled by the noise, immediately started to look around to see where the noise had come from. It turned out that the noise that was coming out of Peter's stomach. He seemed famished and dehydrated after the scavenger hunt Lois had sent him out on. I think I should stop by at the clam for a little to refresh. Hopefully Lois won't notice. Peter contemplated as he drove to the main town. He stopped at his favorite bar, the Drunken Clam, in order to get himself some refreshments before calling it a day. When he pulled the car up into the driveway, he saw to his delight the clam was still open after hours. He entered the door only to find that the entire bar was completely dislocated. The only person that could be seen or heard was Jerome, who was packing up his things. Hey, Jerome, I would like the usual, please, Peter said as he went to take a seat. Upon making himself comfortable on the foam-padded surface of one of the chairs, he noticed that Jerome was packing some stuff that was out of Peter's sight. Hey, Jerome, why are you packing? Peter asked calmly. Jerome never said a word. The only known sounds from the bartender and owner of the clam were aggravated heaps of breath, while he was imitating the sound he continued to do when he was before Peter entered. Just then Jerome spoke. It's nothing, Peter. It's none of your business. Anyway, here's your usual. And with that, Jerome went further onto the counter, placed a glistening cold mug of beer for Peter to indulge. Peter happily drinks it, but of course, Jerome snuck out of the clan without Peter even noticing as he carried a small briefcase with him. Most of the episode was dedicated to Jerome walking down the empty sidewalk, warily glancing back and forth to see if anyone was following him. Just then, without sudden warning, Jerome stopped walking. The backdrop behind him depicted a dark, hollow alley. Slowly, with the precious steps, he slowly made his way to the alley. There was surrounded by darkness, glancing around warily before he did so. A strange noise began to emerge from its hiding place in the alley. In the sound of scandals making contact with the concrete pavement below him. The figure was described as wearing a brown coat, spoke in a whispery kind of voice. The figure advanced towards Jerome, started a conversation, and this is how it went. Figure, did he enter your bar? Jerome, yes, he did. He's indulging himself in what delectable nectar. Figure, for tomorrow, you got all the necessary equipment? Jerome, yes. Figure, good. I'm saying we should give him the proper send-off. Deal or no deal? Jerome, who hesitates for a moment. Deal. After this little conversation between the two, the screen went to black for a little while. The screen then later came back on with the first-person view of someone driving, possibly in Peter's point of view. The only thing that was visible in the interior of the car was the Spooner Street as it was shown with the glistening stars of the night sky. Peter was driving back recklessly along across the streets, possibly due to the beer he drank earlier. Eventually, it showed the car swerving onto the driveway of the Peter Griffin house as Peter got out of the first person from earlier, as sees and show Peter entering the house in a drunken superior. It took him a while to stand up to get him to him and Lois's bedroom. As he got there, he frankly apologized to Lois for staying late. Lois, however, didn't respond to his apology. In fact, she never responded to him at all. All that was heard on her side of the bed was the peaceful snoring. Peter, still in his drunken superior, immediately slipped back into bed and slept peacefully through the entire night. The next few minutes of the episode was dedicated to a scene of Peter and Lois sleeping in bed, which, to be fair, was a bit boring for the viewers watching it at home. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the scene immediately cut to show the Griffin house, while in daytime, Peter was restfully asleep, but woke up to a loud yawn, with it stretching his arms as he turned over to Lois's side to wake her up. However, Lois never responded. Similar to what happened last night, Peter, unfazed by this, immediately got up and was ready to start his day. He went downstairs to go get breakfast. However, when he got there, he saw that no one was at the table. No Chris, no Meg, no Stewie, no Brian, no Lois, nobody. Huh? This is a little odd, Peter said suspiciously. There's no food on the table. All of a sudden, a loud crash is heard, as well as the loud car alarms began triggering the sounds outside and the results, and Peter, immediately bolting out of the house faster than he sped of light, and inspecting the interior of the car. Upon getting a closer look at one of the car windows had been shattered, and the things inside the box, the rusty pole, were missing. Peter was aghast at this, but since his suspect ran away before Peter bolted out, there was nothing Peter could do about it. Peter, upset about the apparent burglary, slumped down onto the living room couch and decided to watch TV. As Peter was watching the usual broadcast channels, he heard something outside. The sound was described as the skidding of wheels, slowly inching closer and closer towards the house. As Peter started noticing where it was coming from, a black tall Jeep crashed through the house at an alarming speed. Peter ducked out of the way just as when this happened. "Hey, buddy, what the hell was that for?" Peter exclaimed with anger and shock. The driver of the Jeep didn't say anything. Instead, he got out of the car, and it took a while for him to step out of the vehicle and onto the floor of the Griffin house. The driver of the Jeep was described as wearing a black robe with a hood covering its face. "Are you Peter Griffin?" the robed figure spoke in a raspy yet audible tone of voice. Peter hesitates before answering with "yes" in a nervous way. "I'm afraid you're going to have to come with me," the robed figure said. "Well, maybe I should, but I have learned not to trust strangers," Peter contemplated. "Mr. Griffin, please, if you would just come with me. If you don't want to come, I'll make you, by force," the robed figure said in a stern voice. "Oh yeah? You and what army?" Peter sarcastically remarked the figure in his rude manner. Unfortunately, Peter's question has been answered. It was at this point when the robed figure put his two fingers in his mouth, letting out a wolf whistle. With his mouth and fingers, it resulted in two people exiting out of the Jeep as well. They were all sporting the same black robe figure that was previously wearing. "Come with us, Peter. Our leader is waiting for you," the robed figure said in an allusion, as they reached their hands out for Peter's hopes of him eventually greeting him. Peter, although reluctant at first, decided to give in to the figure's orders. However, what the robed figures did not know was that Peter's surrender was all a ruse, and Peter was walking down towards the figures, ready to come with them. He immediately yelled and pointed out, "Hey, what's that over there?" The collector figures, obviously to the ruse, looked to see where Peter had pointed. When they had turned to try and collect Peter, they saw that he sprinted across the street, laughing cunningly. It took Peter a long time to get to main town, where everything looked dislocated. All the streets were empty, no pedestrians were in sight on the sidewalks. The only audible sounds were that of gentle breeze in the wind and the clacking of Peter's shoes stepping beneath the asphalt floor. Peter wandered aimlessly around the dislocated street, trying to look for someone. Again, the runtime of the episode was dedicated to Peter peeking for the buildings and trying to find someone. At last, the buildings were empty as he last checked. Even though more crowds at places like restaurants, bars, the Clam included, stadiums, and are more devoid of any residents. As Peter wandered the streets without any hope of finding anyone, the same black Jeep before him was roaring through an empty road. Peter, noticing the Jeep, immediately ducked into a bush, and one of the robbed figures was on top of the car yelling into the megaphone. They were searching for Peter to come out of hiding, and they sounded unhappy while doing so. "Peter Griffin, We're going to say this once and we're not going to say it again. Come on out from hiding. We know you're out here. The robed figure shouted through the megaphone. Peter waited for them to pass through the bush so he can get away from the robbed figures, who were currently out to get him. Peter immediately got out of the bush and ran towards the nearest hiding place, which was a construction site. The construction site was unfinished, walls and decorations that Peter hoped that would help him hide from those figures. Peter managed to stay hidden in the terrain and the decor of the unfinished building until he heard the sound of a car stopping by and click-clacks of shoes. Peter was confused on who was making those sounds until he started to put two and two together, realized that the robbed figures had just entered the building, and that it was their jeep that pulled over near the construction site. Peter, in a hurry, tried to escape before the figures cornered him. He tried to jump out of the unfinished window of the building, but he had to abort as he saw how high the jump was. Peter let out a frustrated grumble as he ran down the floor building as he was heading out of the exit. Two of the robbed figures jumped out from the shadows and tackled Peter to the ground. "Gah! Let me go!" Peter exclaimed while trying to get the figures off of him. "No, we are never letting you go. You're seeing our leader, and that's final," one of the robed figures shouted in a very stern voice. Peter, in blind and rage, angrily brawled with fingers and tackled him. Although successful in his attempt, one another of the figures emerged from behind, grabbing Peter in a headlock. Peter was still in blind rage, angrily bit the figure's hand. The figure yelped back and landed onto the floor as Peter then loomed over the figure, whose hood was open, and the figure refused to show their face. "Who are you? And why are you and your buddies coming after me?" Peter yelled, extremely angry, as he raised his voice in the air to give the figure a hard punch to the face, as Peter was ready to give the figure a knuckle sandwich. A figure turned to reveal their face. It was Quagmire, looking frightened. "Quagmire?" Peter said in shock as he lowered his fist. Peter was shocked that one of his best friends would masquerade a figure who was trying to hunt him down. This left Peter in an invulnerable state, in the state that gives two other figures time to strike. First of all, one of the figures crept up to Peter and kicked him right in the heel, causing him to fall over. Next, one of the figures immediately begins punching and kicking Peter all over the body, as the latter tries desperately to try and get up from the ground. After this harsh beating, the robbed figures then hold Peter by the arms. The camera shifts into Peter's perspective and is to show Quagmire getting up and leaving the scene for a bit. During this scene, the viewers at home said that Peter was groaning in a weak voice, pleading for Quagmire to come and save him. Suddenly out of nowhere, which a wrench was seen, the wrench was described as being thrown towards the camera. Mind you, this was displaying Peter's point of view. The wrench landed hard on Peter's forehead, knocking him out unconscious. The scenery of the scene was now described as blurry, as the figures in Peter's perspective, being depicted as gray lights. Standing out of the much brighter light, the screen immediately cut to black in the tantrum with Peter shining his eyelids, letting the concussion from the wrench overwhelm him. This is where things took a turn for the worst in this story. This is where the episode reaches its climax. The next part of the title of the episode gains a new context and the meaning for the viewers at home. The screen then turned back to normal, with the extreme close-up of Peter's eye. The eyes slowly began to open before the camera cut to show Peter's perspective. Peter seemed to be blinded by the glimmering light emitted from the sky. The camera immediately cuts back to Peter's eye as soft streaks of blood begin trailing down his face. The shot of it begins to whiten slowly as it shows at first Peter's face, where it is revealed to where there was a huge gash on his forehead from where the wrench had hit him. The camera also showed his perspective, but as he looked in the sky wasn't as red like one of those creepypasta stories, but it was a vivid streak of orange and purple lights, almost similar to a sunset commonly used in romance films. The shot also showed that Peter was strapped into a large wooden table with ropes tied to his legs on said table. The table was on top of what appeared to be a stage. The camera went to black of Peter's point of view again. This time his head was tilting from left and right. On his right, there was a blank setting of field of grass, surrounded vivid sunset backdrop. But on his left, something shocked him. There was a crowd of people who were all sporting the same black robes. They were all sitting quietly at what appeared to be on benches, not saying a word. Hey, where am I? Peter said in a stuttering fear of voice. The entire crowd angrily and rudely shushed him in illusion. Once again, the entire episode dedicated to minutes of crowd sitting in silence in front of Peter. The silence was then occasionally broken by Peter trying to crack jokes to pass the time, despite none of the figures actually responding to his jokes. Suddenly, without a warning, the entire crowd of people stood up from their seats. They all started running their heads towards something behind them. Peter, startled by his sudden reaction, also glanced at where he was staring. The camera shifted to the front of the area, where it came revealed to the crowd that towards looking another mysterious figure. However, what made this figure stand out from amongst the crowd is that they were wearing a white robe. This wasn't a normal robe, mind you. This was the same white robe that Peter had found earlier in the episode. The entire scene was silent, but the viewers at home claimed that they heard soft murmurs, one of them saying, "Our leader's here." Slowly, the figure had opened their draw steadily in front of the area, eventually managed to reach the front. The very first instinct the figure did know was to get on top of the stage, then proceeding to where the table was. The figure was staring down at Peter, as the latter took in horror. Who are you?" Peter stuttered in fear. The figure said nothing. The only audible thing was it breathing, not hyperventilating or breathing slowly, but breathing calmly and happily. The figure raised its hand without a warning, resulting in the four robed figures rising from their seats, rushing over to the table. When they got there, they all stood like soldiers, awaiting orders from a drill sergeant. "Restrain him," the figure in the white robe stated. Following the white robe's figure's demand, all four black-robed figures rushed over to where Peter's hands and feet were. They put their hands over their limbs to restrict movement. "Hey, what's going on? Let me go!" Peter retaliated harshly to the figures holding him down. "Oh, don't worry. They'll let you go after I dispose of you," the white-robed figure said, assured yet Peter in a deep yet sarcastic tone of voice. "Wait here. I'd like to make a public announcement," the figure said, no longer sounding sarcastic. The white figure then headed to the stage. The black-robed figure went up and handed a former megaphone, and the figure was started delivering a speech to the crowd. The sentence that follows with a brief description and transcription of the speech. "For years on end, and this incompetent, selfish, dim-witted man has tortured us day by day, night by night, season after season. We all ensure his actions. He made bad decisions. He committed crimes against humanity. He's rude, selfish, and furthermore, he's ruined our lives by walking on this earth. Well, today is a very special day and a different day, you might say. The day we put this man out of our misery. The day we'll never forget. The day Peter Griffin dies." Upon hearing the final sentence, Peter felt his heart sink to the bottom of his stomach like a dense rock in a pond. The camera shifted back to Peter. His eyes widened in shock as his mouth hung agape upon hearing the final sentence. At this point, the figure gave the megaphone away before making their way towards the table. "Look, pal, I don't know who you are, but what's this beef between you and me?" Peter angrily interrogated the creature. "Beef between you and I? Well, I think you mean the beef between me and you," the figure said. "Do you even know who I am?" Peter shook his head in fear. During the scene, soft piano music starts to play in the background. "What do you mean there's beef between you and me?" Peter asked in confusion. "I guess you're not ready to handle this sort of reveal, Peter," the figure said with a soft chuckle. Then, with a gentle movement, the figure moved their hands over to their hood, covering their face. Soft piano music began to swell as the figure did so. Slowly but steadily, the figure uncovered their hood with the whole crowd and for Peter to see. It was none other than Lois, sporting in that white robe. This comes with the expression of pure malice. She loomed over with Peter with over a confident smile. "Lois?" Peter stuttered in shock as his face was in horror. But why?" Because you and me and this whole entire town are sick and tired of your shenanigans. We can't take it anymore. I should have listened to my father. He was right about you this whole time. You're not my husband. You're a sick, manipulative psychopath. A psychopath, for God's sake! Well, no more, never again will you lay your fat appendages that you call feet on this earth. Lois angrily berated Peter. Lois then pointed the four figures holding Peter down the table as she gave out more seats for commands for them to follow. Tighten your grip on him. Make sure he doesn't escape, Lois said to them. Obeying their master's orders, they tightened their grip onto Peter's hands and feet, and this is where things truly got out of hand. Lois went over to the table and started digging through her robe for something. After what seemed like seconds, she managed to pull out something out of her robe. She pulled out a knife from her robe, possibly taken from the kitchen in the house. Don't worry, Peter. This won't hurt a bit, Lois said gently, as she placed a knife onto Peter's shirt, onto the area where Peter's abdomen should be. And with the hands like sushi, the chef cutting a piece of samashi from a fish, Lois slowly began to cut into Peter's flesh. She didn't stab him and cut him in the scene like psychopath you would see in most horror movies. She slowly guided the knife through Peter's shirt, cutting and tearing through the thick skin. She continued to cut into the skin until they were carved into a shape that resembled a capital I. With a careful hands like a surgeon, she dug her hands right into multiple cuts and opened it, as if it were a closet door, revealing Peter's digestive system, the intestines, etc. As Lois was doing this, Peter started wincing in agonizing pain. He desperately had and unsuccessfully tried to fight back against his captors. As Lois continued to torture, first she got to Peter's small intestine. She removed the organ out of the body with one yank, as she proceeded to do so with the large intestine. She then passed the lengthy organs to a crowd of robed figures, like a game of pass the parcel, until she got to them. One of the figures that took the organs threw at an oil drum with fire letting out of it. Peter watched in horror as his organs were getting burned into that fiery pit. Lois, what was that for? Peter stuttered with heaps of fearful full in his breaths. Lois then went over to the table where Peter's head was. She lowered her head down to his own. She then grasped the table with blood-soaked hands. To hasten your death, honey, Lois said quietly, in the raspy tone of voice. Lois, you're being unreasonable. I know you don't like me for what I did in the past and the present, but think about all the times I've helped you. Peter tried to assure her in all hopes that Lois would listen and spare his life. But Peter, you did help me, Lois said in a soft voice at Hurst. You helped me by making me lose my sanity dealing with your nonsensical bullshit, Lois angrily screamed at Peter's face. While doing so, she angrily banged the table with her hands, with each pound causing the table to vibrate and shake violently. This is why I assembled this cult. A cult hate against you. You and your kind, Peter Griffin. Hopefully we can contain in your place that is reserved for the most deserved, Lois angrily explained to Peter. Well, the torture of me pulling out your intestines was only the beginning. Now it's time for the big moment you've all been waiting for. Lois stepped out of the stage and started to walk away. You guys stay here. I'll be right back, Lois said before turning around. That goes for you too, Peter. The screen turned into black like in most Family Guy episodes before it. After a few seconds of darkness, the scene then went back to the crowd staring blankly at Peter. From the bottom of Peter's body had a huge gash from where Lois had ripped his intestines. The four figures from before were standing down holding him onto the table. Their grasps were tighter than earlier. Peter, on the other hand, was still growing in pain, while taking heaps of breath in an attempt to stay alive. Peter tried cracking a few jokes in an attempt to brighten the mood for a bit, but the crowd just continued to stare at him without any response. Pretty soon, Peter, without sudden warning, the figure then turned their heads to around Lois, who was carrying something in her hands. She made her way back up to the stage and headed straight for the table. Without saying anything, Lois, what have you got there? Peter asked fearfully. Lois ignored his question, but did give him a subtle hint for Peter's knowledge. It's something that you've collected for your little scavenger hunt I gave you, Lois uttered in his ear. Following this, Lois went from the stage with another speech to her fellow members. My members today all led up to this shining and glittering moment of truth. After 17 years of never ending torture brought to my life by this man's incompetence, his region of terror is finally crumbling down. Now, Lois monologued the figures. The figures gave a round of applause as they were heard loudly by cheering. After this little speech, Lois again advanced towards the table with intentions of killing Peter for good. Remembering her little hint she had given Peter earlier in a whispery voice, it turns out that she came back with a long metal pole that was from the scavenger hunt from earlier. Slowly and steadily, she aimed the pole right near the area where Peter's mouth should be. Lois, what are you going to do to me? Peter exclaimed in a frightful tone as he started hyperventilating. Lois never answered Peter's question. Instead, the camera shifted to Lois' face, as it features a big smile with multiple rows of her teeth, showing constricted pupils. The viewers at home described the next scene was kind of weird and kind of trippy looking for some. A small montage of some short clips began to fade out of the screen. The clips of very brief were depicted as the multiple activities Peter had committed throughout the show. These activities were from welfare fraud to death as a shadow to the modern episodes, with a cutaway gags including as well. The montage of also included Lois' negative attractions with Peter throughout the show as well. At this moment it plays out, Lois's face began to change. Her smile started widening angrily and larger in tandem with her pupils, to which it started to constrict even more. Although no one in the crowd noticed Lois's disturbing face transformation, Peter was the one who stood from the crowd. Peter tried to wriggle his way out from under the table, but confines were too tight, and the fact that the robbed figures were still holding him down, that didn't really exactly help matter. Lois, no! Peter screamed. Yes, Peter, yes! Lois said, with a slivery hiss, almost similar to a snake. Please, Lois, I'm sorry, okay? Please forgive me. I'm sorry for all the bad things. I regret doing all these things. I made you mad. Please, give me another chance, Peter wailed, followed by a loud sobbing. Peter, Peter, Peter. But I've accepted your apology. But it's too late, Lois said, followed by an evil chuckle. Lois then brought the pole further away from Peter's mouth as she chuckled sincerely. Peter, already aware of what was coming, immediately belted out from one of the final scream, No, 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 Lois! The whole screen was covered in the familiar darkness. That was sound that came from below the TV speakers. From the multiple household broadcasts that were taking place in the sound reverberated through many homes. The screen immediately then returned with a close-up of Lois's face. Fortunately for the disturbed, her face had lost a sinister grin, dilated pupils from earlier, replaced with a frown and shut eyelids. Her head tilted away from the table, almost as if her averted the glare of what was on it. Slowly, one by one, she opened her eyes, tilted her head forward to observe what was on the table. Lying on the table was the body of Peter. The pole had jabbed right through his mouth and stopped right short of the bottom what remains of his digestive system. Peter was still alive, but just barely. Peter was coughing up small amounts of blood as his body was trying to regurgitate the pole out of him. Due to the small multiple parts rust on the pole, Peter was also starting to show signs of a tetanus infection. Despite his body the best efforts to remove the pole, the bacteria suggested otherwise. It started ravening through Peter's body, evident from the guy having painful muscle spasms and breathing problems. Eventually, poor Peter Griffin slowly closed his eyes and stopped moving. Lois was shocked by this, but during Peter's episode on the table, she refused to help him, only to respond with her husband's motion seized. She inched forward towards her dead husband, grabbing the pole sticking out of Peter's mouth. Before she lifted the corpse up into the air, she told the four figures to stand back from the body. She sliced the robes open of the table with the same blood-covered knife. Feeling the deceased Peter, she proceeded to lift the corpse above her head and the huge gash in the latter's abdomen, starting trailing out large amounts of blood. By the look on Peter's face, she was a sort of power surge for her body. Soon after that, wide open grin and constricted pupils returned as she had the corpse up into the air. My members, let us embrace the death of this stupid fat man and hope to God will guide his soul to the fiery pits of hell, where he rightfully belongs, Lois announced to the cult members in the bombastic, sadistic voice. With that speech out of the way, Lois lifted the head up into the sunset-like backdrop as she cackled evilly. In contentment with Lois's lost sinister cackles, the rest of the cult members started to laugh hysterically and sadistically at Peter's death. The vivid sunset-like backdrop slowly faded into a gray monstrous color. All of a sudden, the raindrops began to pouring down on both Lois and the crowd. The rain didn't seem to affect them in capacity. They just were laughing evilly. Some of the blood seeking out of Peter started to dull in the rainwater, causing them to leak down on Lois's face, splattering all over her as she did so. The camera immediately cut to back of the entire area, where the horrid laughter of crowd and Lois continued on and on. The loud sound echoed throughout most of the homes, hosting his graphic broadcast. As the sadistic laughter continued, two lines of the next text appeared on the screen, and both of them said, "Created by Seth MacFarlane. I really hope you're happy." Without warning, many of the TV sets that viewers had owned shifted to black, and the Family Guy credits played as usual, as if nothing unusual had happened. After the credits were over and done with, an Adult Swim Coming Up Next bumper appeared as it continued ahead with the regular programming blocks.